I really like the title Meeting with Ordinariness, and it's never easy to find a title for a whole lecture series, but this is one I have real sympathy with because there's a very fine balance between the ordinary and the extraordinary, and it's actually most interesting from my point of view when those two things lie quite close, laid into each other. And hopefully I'll be able to show some projects to demonstrate this tonight. And part of this strand of ordinariness or extraordinariness is composite orders, which is something that interests me quite simply put in the way of how things meet. That's actually the topic, and it's a quite essential topic in architecture, I think. Something we think about all the time, and therefore it's good to take it serious. And for us, that means I better carry on. Is that the sign to move on? For us, it means that we need to be flexible in how we look at things and how we engage with things, and we need to be agile in how we condition the situations for our architecture. For me, it means also to develop an attitude to enhance an empathy, a sympathy with the world around us, to engage with the world around us as a material and also as a renewable energy, and not in an esoteric genius loci way of finding spirits of a site, but dealing with the actual matter in a pragmatic and sustainable way. And people have been doing that for quite a long time already. And maybe only since historicism in the 19th century came up, there was suddenly a shift between old and new. But before that, things were seemingly merging much more into each other. And people like Bernd Schmutz, whose work we see here on the right, turned that into a real sophistication. This is the pasticcio in Bernd Schmutz's museum in London, which is made from found pieces, from things he collected, but also from new parts that he assembled together to a giant column and order of quite different things. There's a Hindu pedestal in it, there are Gothic parts, and there are parts of the Temple of Apollo. And the interesting thing of different composites for me is they can be juxtaposed, but they can meet, they can be finessed, but they can also be scattered, like on the image on the left. I will come to that material later. This is the actual material of one project that we're doing in Garkau. For our attitude is maybe between those two images, and on the left is something that you may have seen before, because there's now more interest for it. It's a piece of repair from Japan, from the Kitsugi technique from the 16th century, where in a time of luxury and luxuriousness, there was suddenly an interest to pare things down and keep simple as part of the tea ceremonies. And there was a culture of accepting mistakes. And I think for us to engage, for all of us to engage with what is around us, that's one of the first steps to make, is to accept what is there, but maybe also to accept and to accomplish a mistake and something that is broken. And that leaves the process open like a wet canvas. And this is a postcard that Gerhard Richter has overpainted. That's how we like to see our surroundings. They never dry. It's a permanent wet oil canvas that can continuously changed and painted into it and altered and transformed. Composite orders also mean a social energy, something that sets free new space that can be occupied in different ways. And a few years ago, together with the magazine Art Plus, we did this exhibition, the Atlas of Commoning, and it was about collecting different kinds of common spaces. I saw in a bookshelf the Torre David, which was one of them, but also one of the most ancient commons, where the word comes from, is the Boston Common, which is a big, empty resource in the middle of a city in Boston, which is a park. And this park is an open center. And it's actually that open center that allows the parts around the park to breathe and to work, because they can expand around that vacuum in the center. So much that it was even used for cattle and cows. And this is the first project that I have done as a student. That's now almost 20 years ago at the Art Academy in Hamburg. And in a way, it captures some of these ideas. It's, do we have a pointer? Or?
Sorry.
Yeah. On the left in the plan, you see some cupboards, and those cupboards were collected from the school, from other places. And the only thing that we designed is this knuckle at the center, which is a special door where 3 door leaves merge into one. Those secretaries of those offices weren't best friends, so they didn't want an open office, but we tried to make it open as possible. So we have this door leaf that actually joins all 3 rooms together into one when the doors are open. And that's the main thing that we designed, reaching out and embracing those found cupboards. So around those themes, I want to show 5 projects, smaller and larger. And because teaching is an important part of the practice I'm running, the first one is a student project that is actually also quite old already, but it's still one of my ever favorite projects. I think it's from 2010. And it's when I was teaching in London at Kingston University, and the topic of that year was public house, which is basically about pubs. And it's a connection that I didn't know or became only aware in London, that pub actually means public house. So it's a public space, it's a public living room, because flats are small in London. People meet in the public house, and that's where they have parties, that's where they have dinner, that's where they drink beer. They wouldn't do that at home as much as we do it here on the continent. So that's why the public houses are a real social condenser. And at that time, the smoking ban was introduced in London. So we asked the students to design small armatures in the public space in front of the pub to bring the life out on the streets. And one of them, Lydia Grinko and Minsu Kim, they found this bollard. And this bollard is on the pavement in front of the entrance door, and it's in itself already a really interesting piece of transformation, because in its former life it was a cannon used in the war. And it has then turned upside down and was introduced to avoid cars hitting people. So it has a quite nice second life, and now the students came and gave it a third life because they noticed this broken head and they wanted to repair that, but also turn it into something new. So to engage with the furniture inside the pub, they made a negative of the top of the bollard, and they made a counterpiece. And here we see the bottom of that counterpiece that was then to be inserted onto the bollard. And when it's finished, it looks like that, and it actually makes a little table held up with the students' hands that they've also casted from their real hands. So it's also a hint to Greek caryatides, but actually all done in English steel cast iron. And I think it's a very meaningful but also thinkful piece of how to make something sustainable, but also something festive and something sociable with what we find in the city. At the moment, we are working on a project that has been growing more and more over time. It started quite small, and it's now turning to become a little village on the countryside where we're repairing and transforming things. And I call it Repairing Herring. Herring is the name of the architect. It's Hugo Herring. And this is him on the left. Hugo Herring is one of the superstars of the 1920s in Berlin, together with Mies van der Rohe and Taut. He was sharing the studio with Mies van der Rohe. But his ideas were quite particular, I would call it, and maybe not always so popular, especially with Le Corbusier. He had big fights with the Siam congresses and with Le Corbusier, and at the end he was pushed out. That maybe wasn't so useful for his career, but indirectly he influenced I would say the world's architecture quite a lot, because he was interested in organhaftes Bau, and it's in the 1920s, a quite early way of thinking of architecture as a body, and that's why it has been picked up by Actionism Group in Vienna in the 60s. This is by Ordner und Ordner, the magazine. But the original idea was already starting in the 20s, and he was hanging out with Hans Scharoun, and it was about thinking architecture from within, and also about thinking architecture as a process, as something that can grow. And I think he was quite early to say that styles do not exist anymore. That was at that time, and that's something I have real sympathy with, because we are trying to tackle each project differently. We are not interested in developing a certain style. We may have some handwriting that is impossible to avoid, but I actually enjoy finding a particular answer for each project. And Hugo Herring called that individualized designing, and he was finding specific answers for each single situation, maybe a window or a heater. He was treating everything in a specific way and trying to find generic values and being as specific as possible. And at the time, that wasn't very popular. So, because this was when Bauhaus happened and Mies van der Rohe, and people were starting to write manifests, and this anti-manifest that styles do not exist anymore was totally against the white modernism and internationalism that was starting to emerge in Europe at the time. Hugo Herring thought of his buildings as open constellations, as accumulations. And the image on the left isn't by him, that's by us. And that's our reading of Hugo Herring's architecture in Garkau, the site of our project. But it's also based on some writings that describe Hugo Herring's drawings as potato plans. And I suppose I'm the first one to take that really serious and turn it into a potato model. So that's what we did. But the idea is that his buildings work as conglomerates of things. So there's one main space at the center, and secondary spaces are grouped around it. And the building is growing from within, like the body. And those things are hanging together, they're connected by the program linking them. So in this case, this is a cow stable that he designed for 42 cows. This is the space for the cows. He gave them as much space as possible. That was quite radical at the time, when cows were really pressed into small spaces. And he linked the other spaces with food wherever they needed to be to serve this main body at the center. And that's an interesting way to link spaces in a tolerant and organic and maybe more undefined way. And so those buildings, in a way, they don't have to be finished. They could still grow, and one could still add more of these spaces to them. And their shape is not so easy to define. They have no front and they have no back. They have many fronts or they have many backs. And I think that's what makes them interesting. And so I've been looking at Prague or the area around here. And of course, there are potato buildings everywhere in the world and also in Prague. And Santili Eichel is, of course, a master of potato buildings. And Dienstenhofer as well. But in those designs that Hugo Herring developed, there's surely a sensation of Baroque spaces, of spaces that are merged and linked, connected and folded into each other. And this is the farm that we designed, and this is the ground that we are working on at the moment. So on the left, we see the farmhouse. This is the barn. This is the horse stable. This is the cow shed we just saw, and this is for the wagons. And the whole thing makes one loop. So all these functions are connected, and they are like a bracelet, and they lead from one to the other. So he was taking functionalism quite serious, and shapes were bouncing out where they needed to be. And on a farm, there's also the space to do that, and one can do that quite radical because there's no planning regulations, and he can just go up and down as the functions need to. And on the right, we see the barn that he built with the lamella roof, and that's a patent by a German engineer that came out just 2 years before, and this is actually one of the largest examples ever built. This is the cowshed from the 1920s, only a few years after it has been finished. This is an original photo, and now today this looks maybe more common, but at the time in the 20s, where many buildings were plastered in creamy white and smoothened, this was a very radical approach to keep the timber untreated. It's really patchy. The brick, the same. The concrete is not painted, and the glass is raw glass with extremely thin sheets just hanging on the brick. And so one could say this is one of the first really brutalist buildings to give the material the expression that it actually has from the construction. And this is another photo also from the 20s with the plan and the section above. And the idea was that one person could treat 42 cows. And he perceived this cowshed like a machine. And this was connected to farming ideas from the US at the time. I'll soon be finished with the history part. So, but it's important to see what those buildings looked like, because we have now been asked to repair those buildings, and repairing them is not about reconstruction. It's about making them with the attitude of Hugo Herring, with the means that we have today in order to give them longevity and to make them last as long as possible. Because the situation is now completely different. Many of Hugo Herring's buildings haven't been built, and new buildings came. 10 years after Hugo Herring, the site was sold to the Nazis. They built this house there on the left. So at the moment, it's a really big mix of different things. And at the moment, it looks, or the first time you see that, it looks a bit strange, but actually this has been growing on us, because the countryside, as we see it on the photo on the right, is messy, and it's no Hugo Herring wonderland. So this group of heterogeneous buildings is actually quite nice to understand as a village, because the actual village on the bottom right is here. It's just a crazy carpet of single-family houses that is not a real village anymore. So the one thing that we can make work is turning this into a more dignified place of living on the countryside. The place has grown over time. That's obvious from the 13th century to now. And this is what we're aiming for. This is Hugo Herring's vision, and this is in between. So we're trying to balance things a bit more, but we're not reconstructing anything that Hugo Herring built. And we got a good photographer Max Creasy, to take photos of the site as it is now, to survey what is there. And this is how the three buildings created by Hugo Herring meet at the moment. And it's interesting because the buildings always change when you move around them, so they're not really finished. They have no front, and they're also very difficult to put into a drawer, and that's the real quality of it. They have a almost medieval quality, something castle-like. They're extremely rustic. They have very fine lines. They're very thin and elegant. They have almost a graphic quality, because Hugo Herring thought of the body from within, and the facades are almost like a veneer that didn't matter for him much. So they have a real graphic quality that he could cut and move up and down and along, which is something that in contemporary architecture many people look at also. This is the space of the barn now from last autumn. So one of the first things we had to do was clearing the space. It has been filled with lots of things over 30 years. So clearing the whole farm was the first step for us to develop it further. And at the moment, we're having quite a few roles. We're dealing as an architect, of course, as an interior architect also. We're also taking over parts of the landscaping, but a lot of time we spend also as project managers to develop the project, to organize funding and to organize money, to finance those repair works, but also to liaise with institutions, with schools, with festivals, with social partners, with landscaping partners, to all become part of the network that we're building around this village. This is the cowshed in its current use. So this is before the restoration works taking part. And because the world changed in the meantime, those buildings are now empty, and we are in a position to reframe and reprogram and recondition those spaces. This is the reality here in northern Germany, around the farm, and they're not used as farm buildings anymore. And this is why we can now spread it all out, look at what is there, and rethink what could happen in those precious buildings that have just been listed as national monuments. And we have been developing strategies for reusing them, but we have deliberately not developed a master plan because we want to keep the user scenarios as open as possible. On the right, you see the material that is used on the farm. So it's not much. It's bitumen, brick, tiles, cement, timber, and pebbles. This is the palette that Herring used, and we are extending it a little bit, but we are basically keeping to those materials. We are also surveying the landscaping, the plants around the farm, because we need those gray zones around the buildings to make a buffer to the wildlife around it, to the village, but also to enable private and public use. It's often seen as a problem that things are not clearly defined as private or public. And in our case, we see it as a potential that those things are actually folded into each other. So we have housing here, here, and here. We have workshop here, here. We have garages. This will be for temporary public use. This will be for larger events and festivals. And there will be supporting satellite uses around the farm. It was very important for Herring to connect it to the fields outside, and it's actually quite nice how it sits there in the greenery with this patchy appearance of brick and timber, all aged. And we didn't want to replace that yet, so we have been repairing the timber cladding because it's quite nice how it sits there with the foliage, to extend the lifespan of it for another, hopefully, 5 years, as much as possible, instead of throwing it away too early. So we've been working through the whole site and through the farm. There are no plans existing of those buildings, so we have measured every single part over 2 years. We've been measuring windows, but also the entire buildings. We've been surveying the plants around the farm because we like how the site is wild to the outside, but more clearly defined on the inside. This inside space is quite important because it acts like a village square, and it's just that open quality of an empty center that is able to allow many different users around it, be it private or public. And that's why we like that connection between this village typology and also see the farm as a village. And ideally, in 10 years or so, it will be a little bit engaged like Bruegel's painting. But what we try to foster is to make networks with local partners, but also with art schools, with architecture academies from Hamburg, from London, with music festivals. One of the biggest music festivals of Northern Europe will be using the barn. There will be music schools using the cowshed. We want production to happen there as well. We ideally want to allow for some farming, and if it was only sheep. The idea is to have as many different things as possible, and that we do not fix this. And actually, this strategy is a problem when you want to gather money. But I think for the farm and for the place, it will be more sustainable. So on the left, this is our vision of what can happen. So this is housing. On the left, we have a sheep stable, we have chicken stable, we have wind tower. We are adding photovoltaics on the listed buildings. And we want to use that heterogeneous image of the farm to turn it into something dynamic, vibrant, and open. So we did scenarios for reusing the barn, and of course that can happen with markets, as a concert space, as an event space, as a storage for boats in a very profane way. It can be used by schools for workshops, for temporary exhibitions, but mainly it's for summer public use. And we are reimagining the cowshed also as an art space, for example, engaging with art schools nearby from Hamburg and Berlin. Since we also like those interventions by Gordon Matta Clark from New York from the 70s. So on the right, this is a sculpture by Franz West in the barn tower. And this is, on the right, is the space above the cowshed, which was used for the hay, which is a very special place because the ceiling is sloped and the floor is also sloped. And it's just now, since last year, that we've been starting to do the first repair works, and many of them are not very noticeable, and actually that's the aim of it. And we enjoy not acting as an author and fully being absorbed with how Hugo Herring treated the spaces. And so what we're doing is repairing the roof. We are sharpening lines on the image on the left. We have already repaired the cladding, the windows, and the eaves along the tower. On this image on the left, we have now just replaced those windows with very thin timber frames and rippled glass, which wasn't so easy. So those frames have had to be made from timber. We also wanted that, and we only wanted them 25 mil thick, so they appear as slim as on Hugo Herring's original photos. And on the right is a new roof that we did for the large barn, which is made out of stainless steel. And we found someone who did a bespoke weaving and pleating of the corrugated metal. And this is the only metal that will also survive here near the Baltic Sea, because the air is so salty from the sea. So we could actually only use stainless steel. And it's a material that is also untreated in the same way as all of Hugo Herring's materials are untreated. Here you can see the stainless steel roof on the barn. And this is a quite interesting detail. Hugo Herring did not do a single gutter on the whole farm. We always had special inventions. So on the cowshed, the water is running to the inside, and here there's no gutter there because the gutter is here on the ground, which is a very nice idea because it celebrates the water. You see that running in the channel on the ground, and because it's a large roof, there's loads of it when it's raining. But it also means that over time, much of that water was dripping against the wall and into the basement and caused a lot of damage. So we have kept this idea, but we make the wall more tight with mortar fillings and pointing, so it can be more tougher and more resistible, but we still keep the original idea by Hugo Herring. But those are small things that take quite a lot of time finding those appropriate answers, because the interesting thing with those buildings is that one can build quite direct. So everything you design, you see. There's no thermal bridging, and there's not much to this architecture. It's a lot about plasticity, but there are very few ingredients. So the few things one has to do them right, and we test that quite a lot before executing it. This is a flat roof that we've been doing on the left side, again with those very thin edges. It's not that we pull the bitumen over the edges. we've water tightened the edge differently, and the bitumen actually stops, so you don't see it from below. And on the right is the bottom of the new roof we just did on the barn, and now we'll be following the concrete repairs here, which will be demanding. And those repair works, they depend on friends and on partners, and we are reaching out for this, and we're trying to find help on many different levels. And a very nice group of helpers and friends is the Jugendbauhütte, which is an organization of a heritage committee in Germany. And in every Bundesland in Germany, there's one of those groups. And it's a place where people after high school can do a social year in architecture by repairing listed buildings. So this is a very interesting way to make them engage, to train them also as craftsmen, but also to do something to a very large stock of buildings that are falling apart. And this is them repairing one of the gates that Hugo Herring designed. And it's in a very bad shape, and they're just taking it off. And they will now also be taking care of this large gate, and luckily of all the gates of the barn, taking them to the workshop. And there are around 25 people. They will also have a 1-week workshop on the farm and work through those different parts. And on the left, this is the provisional gate that they have installed. And now, as we speak, they're repairing it. When we do those smaller things, and because we don't have so much money, we have to work around quite slowly. We also engage with bigger ideas, and one of them is how to use the barn in the best possible way. And it wasn't so obvious on the photo before, but it's actually a very dark space. And darkness is something that we usually don't have much in architecture, but for the original use, for storing hay, this was quite important because it shouldn't get light, it shouldn't get heat. And so at the moment, this building is really gloomy, and the eyes have to adapt when you go in. The openings are quite small. And something that was always in discussion is how to make that space more usable for other groups. And so we have made a large model of the barn, thinking of cutting a small oculus into the roof tiles, opening up a small hole in the roof tiles, and having one single dedicated opening, like the openings Herring did, for brightening up one half of the barn and allowing more and different kinds of uses, for example, also for a wedding or for other social events. And I'm showing now a few more of the things we're doing. We're reinstating some of the trees that have been taken away over time. We are also trying to find our own language with models and trying to engage both with the plasticity of the buildings, but also with those very thin graphic layers of materials that he has used on the outside skin. We are surveying the different kinds of windows and doors that we will be repairing. So we have a very large book of drawings already, summarizing all parts of his buildings. And it's important for us to work both in a very precise and defined scale of surveying, but also in a more open and imaginative space of our own modeling and trying to bring the buildings together. And this is a little folly that we're hoping to build. It's not a reconstruction. It's a building that appears here on Hugo Herring's drawings. It has never been built, but this is something that we will want to build as public toilets, as disabled people's toilets. It's a kind of reservoir and a catalyst that can take things that we cannot do in the barn. So it's our Joker building that we interpret from Hugo Herring's drawings. And then there's this long animal, which is very useful because it's for lots of cars, it's for storage, and that allows us to keep the middle empty. And eventually there will also be a head building at the front as a workshop and for groups to have a heated space. It also has those columns that we make from composites of existing footings and new posts, timber posts on top that we connect with a steel armature to make a new composite column for the long car storage at the back. And here on the left we see the building that is like a slice of the barn. It also has inside a lamella roof, and it's intended to be a workshop building for groups, a place where people can also stay over and spend time on the farm. And on the right is the other end of that long stretch with a small box of public information and with photovoltaics inclined south, all meeting at that corner, and that way trying to engage with the plasticity that Hugo Herring has in his buildings. On the same site, we're doing a little piece of housing. So this is also in Garkau, and this is just in our back. This is a promotion, which is recent, of housing 200 meters away from Garkau. And it looks like a joke, but it's meant serious. So lots of cars, no pavement, and cycling on your own car park, but lots of green and brick houses. That's the message. But it's, of course, a huge waste of land and energy and not very carefully planned. And that's why we are looking at using what is there in Garkau as an existing building. This is the one, the ghost building that I haven't shown you. It's at the other end of the cowshed, and it's a building that was originally built by the Nazis in the 30s, and this is a transformation of the 70s, which you can sense probably, and now it's us transforming it again, because we, first of all, we want to pump as many housing units as possible into it. So so far it was 1, now it will be 5 under one roof. But also we want to make it formally more part of the farm. And that's why we will keep as much as possible, but also take away as much as needed. And that's the whole roof, but we keep the base of it and the ground floor and the basement. And this means that we are ripping it, we're gutting it at the center, so we have an open plan. We keep the surrounding walls, the exterior walls, and we are adding terraces for the 3 flats on the ground floor, and there are 2 more flats on the upper floor, so they all have a garden access. And here you can see this house. So when you enter the site, the first thing you see is this enclosure that gives this private terrace a bit of protection, like an arm, and you don't look onto people's coffee table, but also it's a nice counterpoint to look along here. And of course some of these forms may echo what is happening here. But overall, we've been trying to push the building into the landscape in the same way as Herring did. And we have, of course, looked at the houses that he designed. So those are the ones that he designed for Garkau. That was in the 20s, so that's quite remarkable. The house on the right almost looks like a farm in itself, but all of them, they bounce and push and pull and spread and interact heavily with the landscape. Here on the left, again, other houses that he did later, only a few years later, quite radical in their approach at the time and not in any way as dogmatic as the Bauhaus, much more free and open at that time. And on the right is our interpretation of it as far as we can get. On the outside, there have been planning restrictions, but still we make dormers, we make little roofs and terraces to change and to pull apart the volume of the building. And on the left is the plan of the ground floor, which also in a way acts like a body folding all 3 flats on the ground floor into each other. And after having worked on it for a long time, it was quite interesting to find out that working with those curves actually saves space. It's a mean of efficiency, because when our intention was to bring 3 flats down onto the ground with their own terrace, but also with a common entrance. So there was not a lot of flexibility, and using the curves actually helps to come around the corner and make those flats work. That wouldn't work so easily with right angles. So that works in a way like this. This is the entrance for the whole house. We have one entrance turning towards the big courtyard of the whole farm, where everyone enters. It's a shared entrance that is festive, it's big, it's generous, and it's high. It's a tall space that goes under the roof. And from there we have 1 and 2 and 3 flats. This is a single-story flat. These have their own stairs, so you go up here and you go up here onto the next floor. Then there's a 3rd stair which goes under the roof and accesses 2 more units. And this is the floor of the upper floor. So here there are the 2 maisonette plans. There's 1 guest room in the corner here, so this will be used for guests of the farm who want to stay over. And on the floor above, there's a big attic space, which is another flat. So overall, it's 5 under 1 roof. And because we have divided the space into those 4 bays, it's actually quite easy to connect the flats or not, to make them grow, change over time, and to allow for flexibility between the units. And this is a very nice drawing made from drawings by Hugo Herring, but also Miroslav knows that quite well. He has seen that drawing before. And our idea was to make large gables for the house, as it's usually the case on the countryside, with barns and agricultural buildings. One gable that is held together by an overarching structure. And so on the left is the facade idea, and on the right is the structural idea of the gable, because we have big openings, we have timber trusses that are spanning across the whole length over the openings on the ground floor, then held up only at the corners. So it's one big system of a timber framework that is resting on this brick ground floor. And this is sort of what it will look like in a more defined way. And it also has a stainless steel cladding, so it's a long-lasting material that reflects the trees and the surroundings and resonates with the glass of the window bands above. And here you can see the timber structure sitting on the plinth of the ground floor with the matrix of the room. So the whole ground floor is made from brick and everything above is put onto it in timber. Here are some views of the inside with those spaces going diagonal, enabling long views through the flats out on the lake, and the roofs going up to provide extra space with bedrooms, with that dormer, or pulling out to provide sheltered terraces when it rains, which it does quite often up there. Here we see the attic space, which so far was used as a shared space to use for ping pong or parties, but we probably provide that elsewhere on the farm, so it can also be used as another flat. And the idea was to densify space that is already existing, build space of our surroundings that is existing, instead of having this carpet of single-family houses that we saw earlier. So overall in Garkar we have those quite different but also fairly similar buildings, and even the ones of Hugo Hering, so that's all of them except the house, they are quite different. They're long and low, they are high and bulging, they are flat and horizontal, and for us it's interesting to find what is connecting them, that there's a certain balance, because repairing actually means putting things into balance, putting them in parity from reparare, Latin. So it's not about making everything perfect, making everything the same, but bringing it into a healthy equilibrium. And hopefully one day there will also be sheep. I'm showing those two projects more quickly. This one is called Collective Conditions, and it's one near Bonn, the former capital of Germany, in a quite ordinary Western German street. That's what villages look like there. And the building we've been approached for is the grey one, which has been done by another architect who was not interested anymore or not invited anymore to continue further. But it's a fairly recent structure of another architect that we wanted to connect to and that we took very serious. And the task was set by his company, Lindler. Those are the Lindlers on the left. That's their team, and they have a heating company. So they plan and they sell and install heating, photovoltaics, hydro energy, and anything that is around those topics. And our brief was to build onto this building and to add more use to it and to transform it to that grey part that we're seeing here. So that on the basement there's storage, on the ground floor there's shop and offices, on the first floor there's offices, and on the top floor there's housing. So it's this big layer cake of many different things in a quite small building with many constraints that we tried to bring together. And I was told when I was a student working as an architect is often like dancing in chains. And if there's one project where I felt that the most, then it's probably this one, because the existing structure was already so heterogeneous and so disparate and also unfamiliar as an architecture for me. And that's why I enjoyed seeing it like David Hockney's shelf of the Blue Guitar series that you see on the right, where it's totally fine that things are different and each floor acts different, provided there's a little bit that is connecting them, and even if it's only 2 little red sticks and some trays. So this is the thing that we tried to find, something, a structure, a vertical structure that can connect them so that we can make those floors as different as possible. And on the left we see the site, and that's already with our so this is already with our intervention. This is our building that we've been designing. So it's sitting like a bridge above the existing building, and it makes one big composite with a neighbor building sharing its back, all brought together on this spine here. And the other interesting thing was the topic of that company, which is very technical and about heating and construction. And so we thought it's good to use that also as an architecture, so that the architecture expresses that technicality, that we build with technical systems of steel, prefabricated pieces, and maybe actually that it is something like a architecture parlante, expressing the technicality like Piano Lotta's Centre Pompidou does. But actually here there's a real reason for it, because it's part of the program. And on the left we see that composite again of different parts meeting together, and on the right we see the tectonic structure of it. So there's the base on the ground floor with the grey building. There's a wing column with a space frame steel structure. There are 3 girders, steel girders, finding the structural axis on those lines. And then there are prefabricated ceiling elements as floors and a facade cladding everything together. And in long section, not much is meeting, but in cross section, the one thing that is connecting the different things are those structural lines running all the way through, a bit like in David Hockney's etching. And at the end, the building looks like that. So it has this heterogeneous base with the entrance where you go up the stair. These are the shops, and that's what is already existing. It's the grey building that we saw earlier. This is the column with a space frame structure, which is holding up a large gable that we see here, which has to be kinked for planning laws. So we've been pushing it in, or in the other way, we've been pushing out the corners to make the floor plan bigger, to generate more square meters. And because it has this middle axis, we enjoyed that the building has 2 halves, that it has this white half and the black half, and 2 different sides, and they're all held together by this one column underneath. And having those lines here and those center lines allows us to have a simple steel frame, and we can therefore have this plan libre for the housing. Those are 2 flats. There's one here and there's one there. And again, the structure allows us to bounce the spaces for living around those constraints. Here I make a dormer, and the bedroom just tucks under the sloping roof. It's all very tight, but using those contractions and splayed forms allows us to bring as much rooms as possible under that volume. And so overall, this is the structure that we designed, and it would allow different kinds of office layouts, but also in the future different kinds of flat layouts if that's required. And this is the space made from steel and plasterboard, bending and curving along. You want to take that? The project has been fully detailed. It's finished and was meant to go on site 1 year ago, but then with the cost explosions because of the Ukrainian conflict, it stopped for now. So it's in the drawer, but hopefully it will be continued soon. So, and the last project is das Englische Haus. And das Englische Haus is another composite, but it's also the book by Hermann Muthesius, which for me was quite important because I've lived 11 years in London. And I guess many of the ideas that I've been showing today are also based on this arts and crafts book where he collected Englishness, but also a way of informal accumulations of spaces, if that makes sense. So it's a cultural approach that much has to do with England, but it's also a very architectural atlas of an idea of comfort and actually modernism before modernism. On the left is also an English house. This isn't the reality that Hermann Muthesius was describing, but that's just down the road from our site. That's why I'm showing it. And this is now popping up everywhere in London, and we were trying to find a counterbalance to those buildings. And that's why we've been looking at the Englische House. On the left is designed by Voisey, and some people describe him as the first real modernist because he was placing spaces where they needed to be according to their functions. And that links him again to Hugo Herring. And on the right is another English house, and that's the house where I lived for several years in London. And now that the Biennale is approaching, it has been exhibited in Miroslav Schick's Biennale Pavilion, in the Swiss Pavilion several years ago. And it was one of the references selected by Knapkiewicz Fickert, you probably know as architects. And they've picked my house. This is actually my window. This is their photograph. And the quality they like is, of course, that bay window where the living room becomes part of the street and you feel like you're sitting halfway on the street, but mainly also those common stairs and those public stairs accessing the flats, but also being open to the street are very special. And when you go up, sometimes you see people there, it's a bit like a human theater, so they always feel lively and active because they engage with the pavement and with how the pavement meets a vertical stair. So those things we try to weave into our project, and this project is a site, it's this one here, and this is already our project from above. On the left, you see a car wash. This is our site. This was the building that was the existing situation when we found the project. What can only see here in the back is this listed building that we quite liked because of these arts and crafts qualities, the chimneys and the roofs. So what we tried here is to connect to those existing roofs of the listed building here, many small pitched roofs making a picturesque composition of tiny roofs. And we sort of made a back wing for that front building, calmer Muse house, again with a composition of roofs. And it's not so clear if it's one building or if it's two buildings connected or if it's three buildings connecting with the building at the head. Here one can see that again, this is the existing building with its loose constellation of roofs, and this is the one where we had to be a bit more organized, also because we wanted to create a large courtyard at the center. Those streets here are extremely noisy, so noisy that it's almost impossible sometimes to cross them because there's really heavy traffic. So the courtyard is the one thing that gives a dignified way to enter the flats, but also a calm space for all the bedrooms to be surrounded so they can get quiet and fresh air. And you can see also from the density that we've been asked by the client to bring as many flats as possible onto this site. We started with 10. At the end, we lost 2, which was good. And now it's 10, but it's still a big footprint. But the one thing that we did was pushing the roof down here at the center so that light comes deep into that courtyard. And so overall, even though we have density, those flats are very well lit. And I think that's always interesting when the client is pushing, because you really have to find the limits of your design and where it skips and where it becomes bad or overloaded, or where you're forced to apply some sort of trick to turn density into a quality. And this is what our building looks like. So here again we see the existing building, which is with this English picturesque constellation of roofs and chimneys and red and white. And we picked up on that palette of roofs and dormers and many windows, but also this mix of red and white. So we wanted our building to work separately, but also we wanted to become part of this whole situation. So it all makes one big lump of a building. And this is the ground floor that you see on the right with the entrance. So you enter here from the street through a big opening, a longer passage into the courtyard. And from there, we have those open stairs, not open to the street, but still open to a shared courtyard, planted courtyard. You enter all the flats. And there are 8 overall. And an important quality of the flats, but also of an English house, is that the flat is a house-like. And we wanted to make it more house-like by giving as many of them a roof. So 2/3 of the 8 flats, they actually have a little roof. Sometimes it's smaller, sometimes it's bigger, but most of them have a roof, and they have an entrance door, their own entrance door from the outside. So there's no corridor or lift or lobby. The access is very direct, as if it was a bit your own house on the countryside. And for that, of course, the garden is very important. On the left is one by Gertrude Jekyll. We're not there yet, but on the right is our garden. And this is the view peeking into from the passage into the courtyard space. And the courtyard itself is clad with thin paper-like sheets of fiber cement. It's a very, very cheap project, so that was also an economical idea, but it also was meant to make the courtyard more leafy and to give it a lightness, because the space is not so big. And because the space is not so big, there was a concern of the planners for overlooking, and we've approached that concern by using a special kind of glass, and that's the one actually each window has 3 different pieces of glass. This one is clear, this one is opaque, and this one at the bottom is mirror glass, so it's spy glass, so you can't look down and directly into each flat. Every view is a bit obscured, and this one you can only look out, but you can't look in. And it's actually acting like a real mirror, which is now quite nice that the trees are bigger and it's reflecting everything around it. You can see that also here, where there's this mirror piece in the window. The tree is now a little bit bigger, but the courtyard at the center has a real room-like quality, and that's something we were after. It's not so tall, it's not so big, it's maybe not a courtyard, it's more a room. And I think that makes it interesting. And a very big presence on the courtyard have those large stairs opening up to the public space. I'm rounding off now with a little part on Turin that I've been asked to add, but I will only show a glimpse of it. Miroslav mentioned that we've been working on this book and research on Curated, 2 architects who worked in Turin between the 50s and 70s. And that was a time when Turin was growing quite a lot. So on the left is an image of Turin. Because of the Fiat factory, many Italians from the south of the country were moving to Turin, and the city has been growing by 500,000 inhabitants in 20 years. So that's very extreme and also interesting to look at now, because everywhere, and I'm sure here it's similar, but also in Germany, there's a very high demand for creating flats. And those times have existed before, for example, in the 50s. And this is one reality of Turin that happened at the time. Build as much as possible and efficient and repetitive. And the other reality is, of course, a very rich Baroque tradition. And that was cultivated by Juvara and Carini. This is Palazzo Carignano. And the architects we're looking at maybe do something in between those 2 lines. They try to make a lot of flats and to maximize, to make their schemes as efficient as possible, to maximize floor area. But the tools and the strategies they're applying, they're taken often from Baroque culture in the city. And at the time, that looked like this. And it's maybe a building that some of you already know. It's the Casa dell'Obelisco that those 2 architects did in 1954. So that was a time when it wasn't very popular to look at Baroque. It also was very unusual to look at Antoni Gaudí. It was very unusual to make an open plan, a plan that is open at the edges. And this is surely a formal interest by them, but it's also the start of their strategy to make the floor plate bigger. So you can see on the left, on the ground floor, the building is smaller and it goes out to the upper floors with those stalactite columns. And the buildings always increase the floor plate when they go on the upper floor. It was also a strategy for them to obscure how many flats are in the building, because the building is so complex and has so much plasticity that for the planners it was impossible to grasp how big it's going to be, because the drawings were going forward and backward and they were very diffused. The house at the time has been called the House of Butter because it looks very liquid. And so at the end, they tricked the planners and they were able to build 1.5 floor more than what's in the building regulation plan. And this is one other social and economic outcome out of those Baroque strategies. I'm only showing these quickly in comparison. This is another situation where I'm showing the city plan because often they respond to very specific situations in the city. And here you can see how their building is made out of 3 parts. When you see the building, it's a very bold gesture because that way they're opening up very giant staircases to the street, which is very powerful. But at the end, it's of course also a response to how those crossings are made in the neighborhood, and it's actually very well tied into the city fabric of that area. But they're using those constraints to turn planning regulations into plasticity and circulation, like they did here on the courtyard side. And this is the third example I'm showing. In this book we're doing, and it's almost finished, but not yet. There will be 12 houses which they executed in 20 years, and they're all completely different. And this is a quality that we really embrace and that I very much admire. There's some similarities and there are common interests, but each house is completely different from the others. And this is one that also has to do with the plot. So that corner house that they've been doing here, the plot was too tight to fit another flat in here, so they turned that area of the house into giant and very large, generous balconies. So that's a very short glimpse of the book, which will be bringing out next year. You can see the cover of it, and it appears already on the internet. It will be available very soon. And don't forget the name Curated. On the left is their office, set in the suburbs of Turin, in a very lush garden. It almost disappears, and it's built into the grass, completely overgrown with plants. And this will be the first book bringing together all of the buildings that they realized. And I will be ending the lecture with this image, again, that the Biennale is approaching. This is a postcard that we did for Dirk Sommer's Bovenbouw Pavilion, the Belgian pavilion 2 years ago, where we've been asked to do a capriccio, vedute, of a city that we imagine and that we like. And at the time, there was a lockdown, there was not much time to realize something, so have not been able to go to the office. So I was at home in the flat. I've just put together what was standing around in the flat, things I like, things I find important, and I made this photograph out of many things I collected on trips and traveling. Some are related to architecture, some not. and turn that into this composite capriccio. Thank you.